I'm of the age where I regularly go to the doctor now. And I don't know if it's just my age, but it seems like every time I go in, I'm asked about my family history and my current medications. And I could have swore I just did it a year ago, and family history has not changed, right? But they still keep asking it over and over again. And I understand why. Because they understand that when they find out about my history and what has gone on in my past, it really can affect my present and my future. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to hear some of the stories from 79 and 80 and 81 and 82 from these folks. Because I understood this, that what has gone on in the past of this church actually can impact what's going on today and what goes on in the future. Perhaps you've heard this quote before: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I wish they would make up a quote that is a little bit better and more appropriate for what I'm talking about today, which would be those who remember the past should repeat it. And here's why. Because if you heard in the Peacocks and then Sammy Prim talking, you heard in there about what went on in those first days and years, where everybody did everything. They were family. All they had was each other and God. Everybody gave. Everybody tithed. So how did the church get to today from there? Because of the faithfulness of the people. The same way that this church started is the same way that this church can continue on. Because of the faithfulness of the people, because of viewing each other as families, for jumping in and not relying on everybody else, but taking ownership of me and what I'm going to do for God. That's how the church continues on. The name covenant. The name covenant. When I thought about that name, I went, well, I know there's a biblical history, and the Hebrew word is berith. And in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew language, that word in Hebrew occurs 287 times. And the sort of the translation for it in the New Testament, you only find it about 33 times, but still a good number of times in the New Testament. So mainly our basic word, covenant, the one that I believe that Mike Watson took the early church through, was based on some Old Testament passages. Now, here's the word covenant. Covenant is a relationship between two partners who make binding promises to each other and work together to reach a common goal. Two working together to have a common goal. And the early church, this early iteration of covenant, they all worked together. What was their common goal? Initially, it was to meet together to make disciples of Jesus Christ in West Dothan. Believe it or not, this was really West Dothan back in 79. This was some sort of more on the outskirts. The basic charge and goal for every church is the Great Commission, to make disciples. So that's the goal of every church, to make disciples. But in those early years, their goal was a building to meet in. They didn't want to keep meeting at a temporary facility or at a retirement home. By the way, they took in a lot of people from the retirement home those first few years, which means they had a lot more funerals in their first few years than most new churches do as well. So when I think about that idea of working for a common goal, the church literally came together. They came together to build that first building, the building now that our children worship in. And a few years later, they added some extension, what we call the education wing down there. 96, the Fellowship Hall. 2003, the McKay Christian Life Center. In 2009, this one. How did all this come about? Because this does not happen by chance. It happens because everybody kept coming together for a common goal. They kept coming together and they were all in. We are called covenant. Been called covenant since 1979. And here's my charge today. Let's live the covenant. Let's live the covenant. So let's look at covenant a little more. Remember the definition of covenant? It takes two. It takes two. It takes two to make a good thing go right. It takes two to make it out of sight. I cannot believe many people in this room knew that song. I was even more surprised at the earlier crowd that knew that song. But it takes two. It takes two to live in a covenant. It takes two to live in a covenant right. And the covenant that we're talking about is between us and God. And God established that many times in the course of the Old Testament. Like the first instance that we see is Noah. The flood had happened. People were horrible. And so God wiped everybody out, started again with Noah and his family. And he told Noah this, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. Wiped out everything else, but God was going to preserve the world through this family. He promised that he would continue this plan of redemption through this family. See, God preserves those he plans to redeem. Then the next covenant we see involves Abraham. Abraham, 90 years old, who we call the father of many nations. And God made him a promise in Genesis 17, then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. God chose this family to continue to be blessed. And this blessing was not just for this family, was to be blessing to all nations. This covenant reminds us that God's plan is always bigger than one person. God's plan is always bigger than one person. It was bigger than the original pastor, Bishop Mike Watson. It was bigger than the next pastor, Joseph Bullington. It was bigger than the next pastor, Dr. Al Harbour. It's bigger than the last pastor we had, Dr. Hayes McKay. And it's bigger than your current pastor, Kyle Gatlin. God's plan are always bigger than an individual person. God's plan was to bless the entire world. That was this covenant. And then we look at Moses. Many of us remember Moses, but I think we sometimes forget about the covenant that surrounded Moses. Because God had called Moses up to Mount Sinai, giving we remember the 10 Commandments, but what we seem to forget was there was a much other stuff that God included. God included basically a formation plan for his people. Instructions, not just the 10 Commandments, but then how to live out life. God had this plan that he dictated to Moses. Moses wrote it down, and then Moses presented to the people. You know what they called that plan? They called it the Book of the Covenant. They called that plan the Book of the Covenant. And they made a covenant Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words from the book of the covenant." See, we know God had rescued the people from slavery, came out of Egypt. And the law was given, these instructions were given not to earn salvation, but really to teach people how God wanted them to live as representatives in the world. You see, God does not save us from something. He saves us for something. He saves us to be representatives in this world. That was the covenant that he was making with the people. He said, hey, this is a two-party thing. You do this, I will bless you. You follow this way of life. If you follow this way of life, then your life will be blessed. And then there's a covenant with David. Sometimes we overlook this. When David actually looks backwards toward the end of his life, he looks backwards and says, if my house were not right with God, surely he would not have made with me an everlasting covenant. Arranged and secured in every part, surely he would not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire. So David's looking back on his life and understands that God had made this everlasting covenant. What's that everlasting covenant? That a descendant of David would sit on an eternal throne. A psalmist actually came up and also reiterated the same covenant. I've made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant. This was the moment that God says, okay, new plan. New plan. I'm going to put a righteous king in place. I'm going to put a righteous king in place. That's going to be my answer to this broken world. A righteous king that's going to come, David, from your family. And then we get into the prophets, who we call the major prophets technically. And we get what Jeremiah says. The days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. In other words, something is coming, something in the future. Now, the people have already been, they're no longer in captivity. So they have come out of being captive. And God is promising to restore them. And again, this is God's people. When we're reading through this lens of the Old Testament, we understand that, yes, he is talking to Israel. This is a message for Israel. But we have come to believe, since we have Jesus, since we have the New Testament, that when we see God speaking about the nation of Israel, that also means he's talking to the rest of us as well. That this is for us as well. This is not just a contextual thing. That there is a both and to the reading of the Old Testament. We read it for the context of the day of the current Israelites we're going through, but we also bring it forward to today and understand it's also for us. Then Ezekiel says this in 37, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant. I will establish them and increase their numbers. I will put my sanctuary among them forever. So David's talked about this righteous king on this eternal throne. God's going to make a new covenant. Then Ezekiel says that I will place my sanctuary among them. Now, what is sanctuary in the context of the Israelites during this day? The presence of God. That's what the sanctuary represented. They built the temple, they built the tabernacle, all that to, quote unquote, have a place where God resides. So when he says this, I'm going to make an everlasting covenant. I will put my sanctuary among them forever. He's promising a covenant that will transform people from the inside out. So God really doesn't just give a bunch of new rules. When you look at these covenants, he's given new hearts. Was it to Noah, he promised that he would preserve his people. Because those he redeems, he will preserve. To Abraham, God made a promise. That was the covenant between he and Abraham. God made a promise. Then Moses, God formed his people with a way of life. In David, God makes a promise to be reigning forever. And then Ezekiel and Jeremiah, it's about God restoring his people to himself. These covenants they don't really just sort of stand by themselves. They're not the one and done things. They're a reminder of what God has done, but also these covenants remind us of what God will continue to do. Because God continues to preserve, he continues to keep his promises, he continues to form us with a way of life, he continues to reign through Jesus Christ, and he continues to restore us through the power of the Holy Spirit. So all these covenants have implications today, but they are wrapped up literally in the ultimate covenant, which is Jesus. They all can be summed up when Jesus comes in person to be with us, because he is the ultimate covenant. So the word covenant appears a couple times in Hebrew. When we read that book, Hebrews 7:22, because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. The old covenant depended on priests, literal priests from the Levitical line, Levi, the tribe of Levi, Aaron, all that stuff, going all the way back to Exodus. But those priests were mortal. Those priests had a beginning and end date. They had an expiration date. And so we're told that Jesus is the eternal high priest. And he makes a permanent guarantee of a better covenant. And then this priest, this high priest Jesus, who is not from the Levitical line, but from another order, and if you go back deep enough into the Genesis, you get this guy named Melchizedek. And Jesus was of the order of the Melchizedek priestly line, on the order of that. Then Jesus takes it a step further, because in 9:15, for this reason Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom, to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. Whereas that line of priests in the Levitical line, they had to keep sacrificing day after day after day after day, year after year after year after year. When Christ came, there was no reason to sacrifice. There was nothing wrong with the old system. They were just following orders. That was a way of life. They were following the form that God had given them. But God saw that was not working. So Jesus came to give us freedom from our sins. Because repeated sacrifices never could fully deal with the actual sin. Only Jesus could do that. Only Jesus could offer that eternal redemption that could not happen with a just simple sacrifice of an animal. So every covenant points to Jesus. He's the fulfillment of every promise God made. What God preserved through Noah, he promised to Abraham, formed through Moses, and foretold through David and the prophets, is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Now I want you to hear this. Noah lived in covenant. Abraham lived in covenant. Moses called Israel to live in covenant. David lived in covenant. Jesus established a new covenant. We are called covenant. We need to live in covenant. We need to live in covenant. Now we're going to develop this later on down this year, but covenant people live fully in Christ. Covenant people love deeply in community. Covenant people serve boldly with compassion. And covenant people lead others on mission. But how do we live in covenant? How do we live in covenant? We value what Jesus values. So how do we live in covenant? We follow these care values. This is how we do it. We live Christ-centered lives. Christ is the center of everything we do. Christ is there when we wake up, and Christ is there when we go to sleep, and everywhere in between. We live a Christ-centered life. We have authentic relationships. We have authentic relationships. Yeah, I know you like to go where everybody knows your name. And maybe those are some really good relationships. But authentic relationships is the kind that our founder, John Wesley, envisioned, where people come together to be encouraged in following Jesus Christ, where we're vulnerable, where we confess, where we have real relationships that challenge us to live a Christ-centered life. And then we have radical compassion. See, I don't believe you can have a Christ-centered life and have authentic relationships with others without radically offering compassion to those around us. And when I say radical compassion, what am I talking about? I'm talking about compassion that will cost. It will cost you your time. It will cost your comfort. It will cost you financially. It will cost you emotionally. It will cost you mentally. Because here's the deal. When you radically offer compassion to someone, it's not a sympathy card you write. It is hands-on. You're with them. You're walking with them. You're journeying with them, which means when they hurt, you will hurt. But the flip side is when they have a victory, you have a victory. Radical compassion will cost. An everyday mission. Every day you're on mission. What's the every day? Every day you're on mission to keep Christ-centered, to build authentic relationships, and to radically offer compassion every day. And when you do that, if you're every day on mission, you know what you're doing? You're a disciple making disciples, which is the goal of the church, which we're in partnership with God. That is the goal. There's a visual representation of these care values. You see it every week. It's right behind me. That window came from the original building. I didn't know much about the Jesus window. All I knew is in 2007, 2008, when we were planning on this, everybody said, we got to take Jesus in the new sanctuary. Jesus has got to be in the new sanctuary. I said, that's a good idea. That's a good theology, right? Let's make Jesus in the. But here's the story. Donna West shared the story about this window. In 1979, Dothan First United Methodist Church sent a team of members to start a United Methodist Church in West Dothan. Two of these missionaries were Bill and Carol Lee, and they quickly became pillars of this new church. Because of their love for Bill and Carol and to honor their dedication to this new church, Carol's parents, Mary Alice and Eustace Bishop, gave a very generous donation to the church to be used for something special in the church building. And they decided that the Jesus window would be the focal point. The idea of Jesus himself with open arms, welcoming all who come to Jesus, was a result of their discussions and their search. So it was the focal point of our first sanctuary, and it's still the focal point of this sanctuary. Conveying the message, the eternal message, that all who enter here are God's children and are welcome. We are called covenant. Let's live the covenant.